Here, we meet our hero Sigismund as he leaves his dying world and struggles to guide his people to a new one. Their journey, difficult and long, takes them east across the astral sea. Music by Marcelo Ventura. Additional music by Hampus Nasalius via Epidemic Sound. Story by Hass Ansari. Artwork by Akifa and Hass Ansari. Narrated by Alex McMurray and produced by Elton Cass. We are Flamingo Arts. Please enjoy your stay. At this point in Sigismund's life, he was as gaunt as the petrified bones he used to collect from the cold, sandy beaches of his home. His armour did not fit, but hung on his frame. His cheeks, which had always been pronounced, looked like two paper-thin kite shields, locked in battle. His stomach was empty, save for the fluids which swayed along with the ebb and flow of the astral sea. It howled for want of food, but there was none to be had. Life was sparse in these waters. Sigismund tried to pet his stomach, to quiet it, as one did with a bairn. He looked over at his sad ship, which carried some 100 men, women and children. He saw his wife, whose face was like the hibiscus plant, a wilting hibiscus, but lovely nonetheless. Her name was Chessa, but she was not at peace. She had been much larger once. Weeks at sea with no fish to be seen meant she had become a pale shadow of her former self. The memory of the warm mead hall in which she used to dance was almost enough to warm his stiff fingers. Almost. He remembered those nights fondly. Sigismund brushed his lips with the back of his hand. They were as dry as the sea salt that stuck to your skin after swimming. He tried to lick his lips clean, but they only split open from the pressure of his dry, cat-like tongue. She was not the only thing that had lost its ripeness, thought Sigismund, as he tasted blood. Everything was dying, and it was not yet autumn. Chessa was trying to feed their son, but her breasts, like his lips, were dry. Dry, like summer grass when the rain did not come. The babe sucked regardless, and Sigismund thought his wife looked so hungry that all that boy could possibly be feasting on was her life and soul. "How you've kept him alive this long is a secret only gods know," he said to her. Chessa did not acknowledge her husband. Sigismund tried to swallow the bitterness down. He knew what that silence meant. Even if he was right, and they had not stepped off the edge of the world as many did believe, she would never forgive him. Even if he helped her down from this ship and onto dry, fertile land, she'd only have more cause to break her vows with him. Did anything sound better than new love to go with the new world? He did not blame her for it. She had not wanted to leave. Sigismund thought about that morning when she had learnt what he'd done. She was out, milking their last cow with those strong arms of hers. She almost cried at the sight of a full bucket of milk. She kissed Baba, for that was her cow's name, on the nose. Then she carried the heavy bucket into the household and saw her son was gone. The boy's clothes were in a pouch tied to his father's belt, and with or without her in tow, he left for his journey to the east. Chessa was the last one to step on board. Her husband had hidden himself away in the captain's cabin, and only revealed himself, the child in arm, when there were many leagues between them and the shore. That was the pay of her labours. Sigismund put a bronze spyglass to his right eye, and peered into the horizon, which at first was nothing but cosmic chaos. Some would have been blinded by the visual miasma, the vortex of white shades and tones. Slowly, the light split into hundreds of lines of colour, and as those colours funneled through the mirrors and into his eye, there came a clarity. It was not a natural thing to do, looking into the very threads of the universe. Every time he gave in to hope, yet he saw nothing but unhatched stars, more stone caps with their stark black ridges and the promise of gold in its veins. The first time they passed one of those floating comets, suspended in the liquid form of primordial ice, some young men had eagerly mined for their life's wealth. Now, while they all starved, the gold they had collected mocked them, for it would provide no sustenance, and could not be burned like the rowans they used to chop down in their village. Now and then he heard the old women muttering, "Should have cut down more trees. Rowan was good, kept you nice and hot, kept the demons away if you cooked them hot enough." He thought of the boy who first uncovered a cluster of solidified stardust. His name was Lukash. He thought he would be rich. Lukash was the first to starve to death. "Sigismund," said a voice. It was Yanis, the farrier who had no horses to shoe. "Apologies for bothering you, but my mother is... well, she's dead now. Just now, in fact. Slipped right into it. I thought she was sleeping." He laughed sadly. "Could you say a few words?" Sigismund closed his eyes. "Another," he thought. "Yes, Yanis. I always liked your old mother. She was a good woman. She used to shoe horses for my father." Sigismund went into the lower deck to take stock. He needed to check the inventory. He also needed to cry, just for a little while. He didn't know if he would be able to leave that pitiful storeroom. All they had left was 3 barrels of mead, 4 loaves of bread, and a single jar of pickled herrings. Not enough to feed a family, let alone his entire peoples. Still, he had not lied when he said he was fond of the farrier. He wiped dust off one of the barrels. About halfway down, there was a name etched into the wood. Paulina's Ales, number 23. Paulina was the stout old woman who had run the tavern with her husband, Arik. She loved to make unusual recipes. Recipes like poisoned apple and holy water, or black honey with elderberry and actual dead bees. Number 23 was, for all intents and purposes, a secret recipe of the highest caliber. All Sigismund knew about the drink, this nectar, was that it was neither too heavy on the stomach nor too light. It was the colour of ancient amber, and at the bottom of the barrel was an old anvil. Yes, an old anvil she had bought from the blacksmith. This one, she used to say, was only for the brave. It was made with fire and steel. Fire and steel, thought Sigismund. He wiped his face dry, and then he lifted the barrel, anvil, and beer with one arm. He heaved the precious cargo onto a pauldron, and as easily as that, walked his way back out onto the deck. He set the barrel down for everyone to see. It made a heavy-sounding thud. But Sigismund looked unfazed. Paulina had stayed back. She's likely dead now. It seems fitting we celebrate her memory along with those we have lost today. He used a hammer and pick to break the top open. His people, eager to fill their bellies, desperate to taste some home, edged forward. Sigismund could see them salivating. He held out a hand and they all stopped. He reached under his cloak and revealed the last of the old man's decoction. It was a see-through vial filled with something that was emerald green. He swished the potion about. A grim quiet took hold of his people. "This is the last of the draft. I do not know how long its influence will last, but we shall sleep for a long time. When we wake, we will likely be hungrier than ever before, but I suspect we will have gotten even closer to land. I will only use it if we all agree to partake in another long night. Any who refuse to drink with us will surely die alone." "What if we find land tomorrow?" asked his wife. Her voice was like honey being poured into his ears, light and gooey and sweet. Sigismund suddenly realised that he had not heard her voice in 5, maybe 6 days. "What if," she continued, "we sleep and sail past the only land to find in 100 years?" I do not think there will be land, said Sigismund. I have not seen any land, save for dead rocks. But what if? His wife insisted. What do you want me to say? He croaked. I do not know. It's a gut feeling on my part. Chessa laughed. It was a ringing rebuke, a chiming admonishment. It was cruel in the way it played on everybody's mind at her husband's expense. Then we will surely suffer. Haven't we lived long enough already? I cannot remember how many ages have passed, and yet my son does not grow. Let us live or let us die, but by the heavens, do not force us to sleep another lifetime away. Sigismund fought to remain calm. If I might say, said Yanis, who had noticed Sigismund's temperament worsen. She was my mother. I do not wish to sleep through my sorrow. Let me mourn her, at least for a little while. It was no use. The people had been swayed. He watched his reflection warp on the surface of the beer. Very well. Paulina's drink is too good for diluting anyways. The young knight led the procession, because he had memorized the holy rites. Usually, they burned bodies, but with no wood to spare and disease on the ship likely, he picked the dead woman up and walked her to the edge of the boat. Sigismund cleared his throat. May your passing bring gifts of fresh fruit. May Zavonia bless us with fertility, so that we may stave off death's embrace a little while longer. Allow Mern to still the ocean while you swim, so that you might swim in peace. May he guide you when you are lost, so that purgatory is not your fate. If anything should stop you and ask, never forget, your destination is the paradise of our forefathers. Sigismund spoke to the dead woman as though speaking to a lost traveller. He pointed back from where they had come. You are unbound to your mortal shell. Fly straight westward, and you will find the old country. There you may live in your home without want of food. By the gods. By the gods, echoed his people. Sigismund threw the farrier's mother into the starlit water. It was always night this far out on the ocean. This was their story now. They had been leaving bodies in their wake in lieu of breadcrumbs since the start. Sigismund placed the spyglass against his right eye. Exclaimed his mother. She was standing behind him, but he could feel her eyes and her judgment. He believed in the power of the spyglass. She did not. Sigismund had faith. It had brought them this far, carried them through electromagnetic winds that were otherwise invisible to the human eye. The witch who had sold it to him said there was a dragon scale in it in place of a mirror. Yakov, thought Sigismund. Yakov was an old man whose back had been split open by kings whose names were now gone and splayed open like the wings of an eagle. Yet he lived on. When Sigismund went to Yakov's hut for counsel, the old man showed no fear for the state of the crops. It must be good to never feel hunger, he thought, as his stomach quivered. Your wife is on death's doors, she said to Sigismund. We've been on death's doors since the day we left. He has walked among us for months. You speak as if you know him well, she responded after a moment. I speak of him as he is, a fact of life. Another quiet moment passed. The astral sea was feeling randy that day. The waves were many feet tall. The deck was wet with seawater and stardust. I remember finding the warm milk your wife left me before she ran to search for her son. You do not follow to help? Asked Sigismund. My legs are not young, she said as she hobbled over to his side. They've not been since you, engorged on your father's labours, fell from between them. So you continue to remind me. It's a mother's right to remind her son what he had taken from her. That milk was hot and foamy. Your wife pulled it from the cow, and then I, on that strength, pulled vegetables from our garden. I understand the concept of sustenance, mother. No, you do not. Your wife does. It hurts me to see you treat her this way. I did not force her to come. You took her son, his mother barked. I took my son. You stole her youth. I did not force her to marry me. Didn't you? You seduced her with your strength and your kindness. So you admit I had something to offer in the transaction, said Sigismund, who had grown tired of Chessa's privileges. You were a peasant, And she made you a knight in name. She's used to castle keeps and feasts of mutton. Empty walls with nary a log of birch or aspen to feed the hungry flames, he said. His mother cursed herself in silence for having given birth to such a perfect man. He could have been a bard, or a scholar, or a smith and master maker. He was all these things and more. He was the hero of Atanus, who claimed his bride by right of favour, her hand for the lives of all those who called the valleys home. But that was a different labour. Where did he get this strength from? She wondered. The gods knew her husband was a simple carpenter. Bless his soul for never questioning her honour. Lesser sons have been born and, for their courage, summoned the ire of the father, but not her Andrush. She barely saw her husband in her Sigismund's face. Andrush was kind and gentle. He never asked those questions that played on all the minds of their friends. You see, Sigismund was just too much. He must have been half a god. Which god, they used to whisper? Which god did she seduce? She was a fine woman once. She could have done it, they used to say. Do you remember when you slayed the troll? She asked him. Which troll? He said, and yet not smugly. The one who'd eaten the unicorn. You cut the corpse free with Andrush's hunting knife. Ah, yes, he muttered. You took the unicorn's horn and its bones, and having watched the smithies work for but days, forged your own steel sword. Mother, I was there. If there's a point, you must get to it. They all heard his mother's hand strike his face. They all watched in terror, except his wife. Chessa did not fear him, the same way her mother by law did not fear him. Sigismund would rather maim himself than strike an unarmed woman. Maybe she was the goddess, thought Sigismund's wife, for his mother's hand left a bruise, and that was not a common thing. She had struck him so hard he had almost dropped his spyglass. His right eye was no longer the cool blue of autumn's coming. It was a bright, fiery green, like that of a vengeful spring. It would stay green till the next he used it. You'll listen when I speak to you, you foul boy! Sigismund swallowed his anger again. I'm sorry, Mother, if my preoccupation had hurt you. Gods, where was I? Ah, she recalled. You made one sword your whole life, and it was the finest sword any had seen. Master maker of swords and arms never touched his forge again. If you could do that, and you could slay trolls or topple castle walls and sing songs to call lost sheep, why could you not find a solution for us now? I did, Mother. This is the solution. He pointed at the hull upon which he stood. It was not your solution, she said. It was an old man's solution. He told you a story and it drove you mad. He was no old man, shouted Sigismund. His spine was severed and his ribs rendered open. His lungs had been pulled from their sockets and displayed like red wings. Have you ever seen a mortal live through such things? Magic does not make a man wise. Don't you see that? Sigismund charged towards his cabin. I grow tired. Wake me if by some providence we find land. Otherwise, let me sleep. May it be deep and long, Lord Sigismund, said Volkov. Sigismund stumbled at the sound of his old friend's voice, for they did not talk often. Volkov was once a hunter. It had been some time since he had caught anything, of course. It had been an even longer time since he called Sigismund friend. That was a time in which they had been equals. These long nights, Volkov loitered with the other bitter old men who used to hunt. There was Mikolaj, who only had one thumb, and Petr, who Sigismund had always referred to as old man since he was a child. That was how Sigismund liked it too. He liked when they kept to themselves. Indeed, said Sigismund. Volkov wrapped his large, red-haired knuckles around Sigismund's shoulder, like a brother might. Sigismund's eyes dropped to where Volkov's heavy hand had taken roost. He pondered on whether or not he should crush those clumsy snowballs. Worry not. I shall watch over things here while you rest. Volkov spoke from deep within his partially exposed, pale, sweaty, hairy barrel of a chest. Shall I find Chessa and send her to you? He asked, innocently. No, growled Sigismund. Playing watchguard should suffice, Volkov. Sigismund pushed Volkov aside. He had walked past Yanis, who was serving hot water, and he decided not to stop for his share. I only meant to offer you my aid, friend. You need not be so crass. Sigismund delved into his cabin and shut Volkov's voice out of his head. Sigismund did not know for how many hours he had slept. He only knew that it had been a long time, and he missed the dumb confusion of it bitterly. He rubbed the yellow gunk from his eyes. He rose from his bed, and upon seeing his skeletal feet, he wept. When he was done being sad, he dressed himself and donned his armour. It was a heavy breastplate. You'd have to be as strong as Sigismund to wear it after so many days without food, and soon no clean water either. The thought of it played on his mind. He slipped on his gauntlets slowly, for moving too fast was making him dizzy. Some fresh air would do him good, just as soon as he grabbed his sword. Whenever he slept, he left the sword within arm's reach, propped against a bedpost. As his fingers reached out for the familiar texture of his crossguard, they felt only air. His sword was gone, stolen while he slept. What was this feeling coursing in his blood? It must be rage, slow and toxic. The adrenaline felt eerily similar to strength. In fact, it felt good. Tight were the stairs that led up to the cabin doors. Eager were his fingers, which thirsted for something to break. He threw the door open, was blinded for a moment by the light of some star they had stumbled across during his slumber. It was the size of the moon, and hung delicately above them, as if from a string. Sigismund drew his spyglass, which was heavy and bronze and deeply magical. He took slow steps, and all the travellers had assembled at the bow. They knew what happened. Between them and him was Volkov. The hunter was twirling the sword in circles. How is it that on this god-forsaken sea, the rest of our swords have rusted away while yours ever gleams? Sigismund sighed deeply. It has unicorn bone in it. It is no normal sword. Indeed, yelled Volkov. To best this blade, I would need my own unicorn, but ho, the slaying of a unicorn is forbidden to all civil peoples. They're beings of light, Sigismund. I did not slay the silver horse. I found him in the stomach of a troll, he roared. I know the damn story, said Volkov. Sigismund held out his hands in question. So what are we doing here? We're disarming you of your power. We're tired of this mad journey. There is no east. You will take us back where we know there is food. The fruits are rotting, yelled Sigismund. The wheat does not grow. He stepped forward. His voice became softer. The barns are born early and die in their mother's hands. I'm trying to save you. You are trying to be king, and our peoples have no kings. The kings have been forgotten. They are history. Volkov placed the flat of the blade on his shoulders. You recognize this stance? No, said Sigismund, unabashedly. Of course you don't. You've never studied a day in your life. I never needed to. I don't need names, said Sigismund. All I see is a sword held, and I see its strengths and weaknesses. I'm better than you, hissed Volkov. At sword fighting? Yes, you are. You have more skill, said Sigismund. And still, it will not save you from me. They all watched as Volkov swung Sigismund's own sword. It glided through the air like mercury. Volkov was aiming for Sigismund's throat. It was a swift cut. It would have found and killed anyone else. But this was not anyone else. This was Sigismund. There is a way to stop a man in his tracks when they lunge forward to strike. You must use the ball of your feet and push against their hips or just under the shin. Timing was everything, but Sigismund, at any rate, kicked like a horse. Volkov's knee caved inward and the blade arced down wildly. Sigismund caught the blade in his cuirass, his steel hand. He tried to wrench the blade from Volkov's hands, but his old friend was strong enough at least to hold on. So Sigismund struck Volkov across the temple with his heavy spyglass and crushed his right eye. Did you think my sword was my strength, Volkov? This sword, this paltry thing the master maker quit his life's work for, means nothing. Sigismund snapped the blade in half with a flick of his wrist, then ran the spyglass back across his old friend's face a second time. This time, Volkov's cheek lost all form and structure. The brutality was not over yet. The hunter fell to his knees. The fight was won. There was no need to continue. But Sigismund still had his broken sword and his anger. He was angry for the betrayal and also for the sheer stupidity of the man before him. "When will you all learn that there is no man alive that can kill me?" he roared at the mass of people who watched. His mother, his wife, and the rest of the old country. A cold silence spread through them. He used the jagged shard of sword steel to cut in and across Volkov's stomach. A deeper silence befell the ship. Sigismund paused and thought about the process he had started. "What's the matter?" groaned Volkov. "You've begun it. Finish what you've started." "Worry not, Volkov. I have performed the red rope before. I, Sigismund of Atanus, find you, Volkov Bocek, guilty of conspiracy and mutiny. I sentence you to death by the red rope. May you be chained to the bottom of this cursed sea till the end." Horror was voiced by the onlookers. Sigismund looked about the ship for something heavy. His eyes fell on Paulina's number 23. It would have to do. Out with the old, inevitably. Volkov tried to be brave, but he cried in the end. Still, Sigismund bore his hand into the body. He found a severed tail, then tugged and tugged so that Volkov's insides were splayed on the deck. Volkov screamed for mercy, but our hero was deaf to them. Sigismund tied the tube around the barrel of beer, then, with one hand, he took the barrel, and in the other, he collected his old friend's writhing body. Volkov was too strong for his own good. He was still alive during the ordeal. It shocked our hero, what even a normal man could endure. Sigismund approached the edge of the boat. He felt Volkov's warm blood soak into his undergarments. It smelt like iron and salt. It felt like holding a gut pig. The astral sea came into view. He paused for a second. "We could do with some meat," but then no more. He threw both barrel and body into the water. None spoke. The sword was broken. The party disassembled. All that was left when he turned was his wife. "Did my son see it?" he asked her. "See what? His father enacting the judgment of the gods? Why would I let him see that?" "Good," said Sigismund, who took the still well-faring spyglass to the helm. "You took a time to throw Volkov's body into the water. Did you regret what you did?" she called after him. "Regret it?" he asked. "No. I was considering cooking him to eat. I decided against it. Better that my boy died than he grew strong on another man's flesh." Chesa was sick, but he did not care. He put the spyglass to his eye and watched. Does it need to be said that never again did they disobey him? They said he was a god. Some treated him as a god. At this point, we're going to take a short interlude. Please pause the video, grab yourself a drink or some food as we approach the conclusion of Sigismund's tale. Part 2. Sigismund was standing in a puddle of blood and seawater. When he looked down, he could see its mixing, the blood of Volkov, the stardust of the sea. He did not step aside when the women scrubbed the deck. Indeed, they scrubbed his boots clean also. It was while contemplating Volkov's life and death, and the unfairness of it all, that his eyes fell upon another stone cap in the distance. Just another rock, he thought. This is what happened when he listened to his wife. He knew he should have listened to his gut, and his gut alone. He was sure it would be time to enter the long night. He was sure, till he saw the curved lines of a wispy cloud hovering between the rock and the sky. He checked the front of the spyglass, which, in anger, he had used like a club. There was some dried blood that coated the ring of bronze like red lichen, and he noticed by the reflection his eye had become purple. There were no cracks, though. He looked through it again, and this time, once the hot white cosmos cleared, he saw those lines move in the manner that jellyfish did, up and down, slowly. But they were not jellyfish. "Birds," he said. "Birds! Birds!" he roared. Men and women surged towards him. They did not look through the spyglass, for they feared what ill effects it might have on their vision. They did, however, in time look upon those birds, and not just a handful. Hundreds of birds were flying in order. The land, which looked to Sigismund like just another mass of dead rock, now clearly stretched too far and wide. There were huge, gargantuan cliffs, and on them were tall, verdant trees. They welcomed the sound of the birds. Then they heard it, a roar to shake all their hearts, and in its wake a tidal wave which was travelling the wrong way. It crashed against the boat, spilled over its edges, and to Sigismund's sadness absconded with one of the few remainers. The sea eventually settled. It was stark and quiet. "What was that?" asked his mother. "I do not know, mother," he responded. He did not want to, but he reluctantly put his spyglass to his eye. There, he saw a dragon, or a serpent, and it was as large as the world they had left. Its pale blue head took a bite of the cliffs, and what was left was a mountain and a valley. Having contented himself with that variety of rock, the serpent flew languidly over the land. All that was left in his wake was a smouldering caldera, its heat not seeming to bother the serpent in the slightest. Its scales and its teeth were impervious to all. When Sigismund removed the spyglass from his eye, it was left golden in hue and throbbing painfully. For a few moments he could not see anything on his right side. "Son," said his mother, as she grasped his elbow. His vision returned to him in waves of pain, and the blackness became dimmer and dimmer, till it was but a dot. "I'm fine," he lied. The dot did not leave. He could see everything but what was in that dark spot. For the first time in his life, Sigismund was afraid. "What is it?" asked his mother. "It is a dragon, the size of mountains." His people did not want to say, ever did the gods mock them. "It's the only land we've seen in weeks," said an old man. "We'd die before we reached our old home," said another. "We would die before we reached a decent valley on this island." And they argued. To Sigismund, the answer seemed simple. There was something living on this island that was not unlike that of a god. He'd heard stories of serpents before, whose coming signified the end times. "To save the land, we must chase the snake away and forestall the dying of this country." "But how will you do it?" asked his mother. "You've broken your sword. Not even your hands could break a dragon's scales." "We'll have to use a bow and arrow, like the hunters." "The best of us was Volkov, and you slayed him," said the old man. "Have you ever shot an arrow before?" "No, but I will do so now and it will strike true. Is there one for me to use?" "Plenty," said the old man. "Iron wood does not rust like swords do." "Then bring it to me, and wish me well." "It's not I who you must ask for a blessing," the old man said. "When a young man goes questing so readily towards his doom, he must do so with his mother's blessing." Sigismund remained quiet. His people watched him expectantly. The tradition the old man spoke of was not insignificant. Every hero, every bogatyr before Sigismund had asked their mothers for a blessing. "Will you not even ask?" she said. "You will either give or you won't. You know how I feel about you, mother. I will not beg for it." And like a stubborn mule, he readied the cape of his wife's old house and bound the coat of Atanus to his pauldrons. Others had prepared a small boat, which was empty of provisions, save a single skin of water. He climbed on, and he added a considerable weight, even when he stood so thin. "I go alone now. Will I live? Will I die?" he asked. "You may live, or you may die," they responded, save his mother, who remained quiet. They had spoken. His fate was unknown, but he would venture on anyways. Then he motioned for the men to start, and they did. As his boat touched on the water, he saw his mother's reflection on the astral sea. "You have my blessing," she called after him. He did not respond, save a salute in departing. He, like many heroes, were accustomed to the quiet. His boat passed between some rocks and ground itself on plush sand. A heavy plume of smoke rose into the air from the caldera, whose heat he could see even beyond the remains of the cliffs, whose tops had become serrated like a bread knife. The scent on his nose was of brimstone, and he marvelled at the snake's body. His head was seeking food many miles away, but his huge body was still extending from the water. He bound the boat to a rock, inhaled the sea foam and hot rocks, and was on his way. All the time his eyes throbbed. There was a sun here, he noted. He climbed over rocks and stones and up hills, and began to sweat in his armour. Sweat. He'd forgotten what sweat felt like out on the cold sea. It was becoming unbearable, and he worried he'd cook alive in his metal suit. Then Sigismund had a thought. The serpent was large. His form went on for miles, and yet his head was not visible. Did men always notice insects as they crawled up their legs? Siegfried took refuge in the shade of the beast he intended to slay. He walked past the ruins of an old building. It had crumbled, and he did not recognize its make. There must be people here, he wondered. Sigismund climbed down through the roof which had collapsed, and fell into a bedroom. It was empty, save for a clay pot and some flowers and a small hearth. There was a thread of carpet, of innumerable patterns. The flowers were in the process of wilting. Not dead yet. The ashes were only some days old. They must have fled the serpent. A red door hung off its hinges. Sigismund walked through the sunlit passage into a larger room. Hanging from the wall was a pendant made of blue glass that looked like an eye. He took the pendant down from the nail it hung from and placed it around his neck. An eye for an eye. Perched in the rubble, under a length of the serpent's body, cool in the shade that had been made because of it, were a roost of 5 eggs. They were as tall as he were, wide and spotted, and had the most perfect roundness he had ever seen. They were warm to the touch. He made note of them and carried on. When he finally saw the dragon's head, his heart trembled. He ran from out under the creature's blue body. He crouched and crawled behind some upturned tree roots for cover. He peeked from between two, and hoped he was too insignificant to be noticed. The huge head of the serpent paused. It faced away from him, but when it breathed in through its nose, all things moved away. He spoke. It was a voice as old as the ocean, and a language that was simple in its speaking, and somehow he understood the serpent, for it said,
"I can smell you, man-god. I can smell the divinity in you. It is faint. You were not born with it. No, it has been given to you."
He began to turn his ancient head. Fear grasped Sigismund. It did not occur to him that anything that could talk like this creature did could be reasoned with. He notched the arrow into place, and pulled the arrow back till his hand sat beneath his chin. The dragon turned ever closer, but it was a slow process, for he was old and very large. Sigismund held his breath. Some clouds parted, and a dim red disc appeared. It reminded him of the king's coin, flat and copper. Then the sun died and was blackened. Did he just eat the sun, thought Sigismund, but then, with a flash of red gold, the sun returned as quickly as it vanished. Of course, it was the serpent's eye, he realised. Now, thought Sigismund, Just as he was about to let go, his own eye throbbed in pain. Half the world had gone dark, and he could no longer see the drake's face. All he had was faith, and maybe dumb luck, so he let loose the arrow. For the first and last time, the strong twang of that string sounded and snapped, and the reverb was so great that the wood of the bow splintered and unwound itself into no less than 100 fibres. The arrow travelled faster than the sound it had made on its takeoff, and Sigismund did not know if the arrow had landed, only that there was the sound of distant thunder, followed by the dragon screaming. So loud was the dragon that Sigismund's left ear popped and bled, and the pain was so swift and excruciating, as if someone had bludgeoned him with a cudgel. Sigismund collapsed among the splinters of his hunter's bow. There was a stillness in that verdant country. The return of the serpent to the sea from which it had came had almost destroyed the boat, but it lasted till it was grounded onto the beach, and then it crumbled. The people of the West forgot how to build them. The people of Atarnus trekked the same road their hero had done, and they had time that he did not, to eat berries and pick fruits. His wife, Chessa, sat on a stone and was calm, for finally she had milk to spare. They left her there with young men to guard her. And those young men looked on her very little, for she was Sigismund's wife, and therefore a queen of sorts. The rest searched for their leader. His mother found him in the rubble. He was standing before a primordial egg. They watched him as with sound jabs he smashed his way through the shells. Inside was a half-formed child. Sigismund's hand was so strong and inevitable that the serpent's head was crushed. He took a loose piece of eggshell and used it to scoop out the dragon yolk. It was hot and inviting, and he sucked it clean. Siegfried was ravenous, and so he stuck his head into the shell. He ate and ate and ate, till he had fallen into its birthplace and coffin. He broke his way out, wiped the yolk into his hair, then used his gauntlet to wipe the yolks from his face. It was a sight that they would never forget, nor would be allowed to be forgotten. He was Sigismund, half blind, half deaf, the knight in the shells.